evolution. It lives to kill, a mindless eating machine that will attack and devour anything. One terrified you like nothing you have ever experienced when it captured your imagination and tapped your fear like no movie before it. Then, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, two continued the legend and spread the fear. Next summer, nature's most terrifying creature takes on an all-new dimension in an all-new adventure. And for the first time, the terror of Jaws will not stop at the edge of the screen. Jaws 3D. The third dimension is terror.
In 1975, Jaws changed the business. It launched the big summer blockbuster, it launched the career of one of the most commercially and critically successful directorial careers, and changed how marketing was done for big films. It also created a movie monster as memorable as King Kong and Godzilla. Then, it launched 3 sequels. Sequels weren't as in vogue as they are today, but they had existed since the dawn of cinema. George Méliès's Trip to the Moon even had a sequel of its own. In the 70s, a successful film didn't mean franchise potential. In fact, it didn't necessarily even guarantee a follow-up. But Jaws would. 3 to be exact, starting with the aptly named Jaws 2 in 1978, 4 years after the original sensation. Spielberg had initially decided against returning to the helm, but when director John Hancock was released, Spielberg thought about a return to the film that had made him. Eventually, after a few days at the typewriter, Spielberg said, I can't. For me, the sequel becomes a real fish story. I called Sid Sheinberg, president of Universal, back and said I couldn't do it. I decided a sequel would not be an exercise in expanding my own horizons. It would be corporate business. Spielberg wanted to kill the original idea for Jaws 2 and resurrect it as the story that Quint tells about the sharks circling the survivors of the USS Indianapolis. Sid Sheinberg rejected the idea out of hand. Jaws 2 went forward with new director Jeannot Szwarc, who had a prolific career directing television, and the feature Bug, written by horror legend William Castle. Jeannot may have been a new face for the franchise, but production designer Joe Alves was not. Joe had been there since the beginning. The very beginning. He had created the initial sketches of Jaws before the script was written and before Spielberg had signed on to direct. The finale of the original Jaws leaves no unanswered questions. The shark is dead, Quint is dead, and Hooper and Brody are alive. Everything is settled. So how do you make a sequel? The main continuity from the Jaws franchise is 1. There's a shark. 2. There's the Brody clan. The two are so closely linked by the final installment that the shark seeks revenge on Ellen Brody, the family matriarch. The problem with keeping the films about the Brodys was that the Brody you loved, played by Roy Scheider, had had his fill of the franchise after Jaws 2, in which he was nearly impossible to work with. Joe Alves, production designer on Jaws and Jaws 2, and director of Jaws 3D.
After 2, no one would even approach Roy. He didn't want to do 2. He was very, very difficult on 2. He had a problem that he loved to go in his little bikini black bathing suits and lay in the sun. He had a little sunscreen thing there on his face so he could get darker. And Michael Butler was a cameraman on 2, and the beaches were very white and it was very bright. And he said, I'm really having a hard time matching him from shot to shot because he gets darker and darker. And everybody of any importance in the film on 2 went to him and said, Roy, you got to stop doing this, And he did whatever he wanted. And he and Jeannot had a problem. They actually had a physical fight in Werner's office about something, but he really didn't want to do 2, and he had a contract that if they did a sequel, he had to do it. So.
When the movie Jaws first opened, it created a sensation. And shark sightings increased by the thousands in all the vast and unknown depths of the ocean. How could there have been only one? Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, the legend continues.
Jaws 2 would become the highest-grossing sequel at the time, and so it was only a matter of time before Jaws 3 would become a reality. Surprisingly, Jaws 3 was almost a comedy co-written by John Hughes. The film was titled Jaws 3: People Zero and would have been a send-up of the Jaws franchise by National Lampoon writers, which included jokes like a mentally handicapped person asking for an autograph by saying, "This means a lot to us. We're retarded," and Jaws writer Peter Benchley being eaten by a shark in a swimming pool. Joe Dante of Piranha and later Gremlins was hired to direct, but the project was canned.
I was in New York doing a picture called The Ninja with Zanuck and Brown. Irv Kirchner was the director. And we worked on that for 7 months. I scouted Japan, and Irv kept playing with the script, and it was taking longer, much longer. He couldn't get it cast. So there was a problem. They shut it down, and they said, well, just hang in there. They paid me for a while. And then they just, somebody else had bought Fox Studios. This was a Fox picture. What they did is they canceled anything that wasn't already shooting or cast. And so I came back, and I went to see my good friend Verna Fields, won the Academy Award for editing Jaws. She was now like a vice president, and she had an office. When I got there, I wasn't aware of the Jaws 3 People Zero. But she said, oh, that was pretty disgusting. I think Joe Dante was going to direct it. And basically, they were going to make fun of their most successful movie and make us all look like idiots. And Steven had heard about it and got really upset, and so they decided to cancel it.
Richard Zanuck and David Brown, the producers of Jaws, then sold the rights of a Jaws sequel to Alan Landsberg. Landsberg was good stock for a marine adventure, since he had produced the National Geographic series The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. The film would need a new direction and a new director, which wound up being Joe Alves. It would be his first time directing, although he had done a good swash of second unit work on the first 2 Jaws films.
Zanuck and Brown had lost interest in doing another sequel. And the sequels weren't too popular at that time. It was not like today. They said no, they didn't want to get involved in a third movie or second sequel. And they sold the rights to Alan Landsberg. And Alan was a television producer. He did That's Incredible, but not really heavy dramas. And Verna says, you know, they're going to make a mess of this. Try to save the franchise, you know. I really didn't think there was a need for a second sequel. But when it presented itself and gave me an opportunity to direct a major feature, I said, okay, I'll see what I could do so it's not going to be a disaster. So I went over and I talked to Landsberg, and he said, oh, well, you want to produce it? I said, no, either I direct it or I don't want to be involved. And he said, oh, well, okay, look, why don't you go scout water parks? At one of them, they had a film that was underwater, of tide pools, coral reefs. It was just beautiful swimming through all this, and it was in 3D. And we came out, and I said, no, get this. If we do Jaws 3D, it really takes the onus off the 3, and it's going to really spark an interest because it's Jaws 3, but in 3D, you know. And so I came back, and I made a drawing of the shark coming at us, and I had Jaws 3D coming, you know, bigger at us. Took it to Landsberg, and he got all excited, and we went to Sid Sheinberg at Universal, and I showed it to Sid. He got excited, and he says, can I have this? I said, of course you can. You're the president. And then I want to show Lou. So he took it up to Lou Wasserman, and I was like, oh, okay, good. All right, you're going to direct it. And that's how it started.
The film Alves had been inspired by was Sea Dream, a 28-minute film that premiered in Marineland in Florida in 1978, directed by Murray Lerner, whose 3D work included Disneyland's Magic Journeys. 3D technology was re-entering the public sphere during this time, after being usurped by CinemaScope in the hearts and minds of moviegoers by the end of the 1950s. In the 80s, 3D, as it was in the 50s, became closely tied with the horror genre. More specifically, horror sequels. Amity Horror and Friday the 13th would use the technology to drag theatergoers back to the cinemas.
Friday the 13th, Part 3. A new dimension in terror.
This house has a supernatural power to attract audiences. It is the Amityville Horror House, a landmark in the history of motion picture shockers. Now, that power has expanded. Amityville 3D, a film that will draw you into the unknown, envelop you in mystery, and engulf you in evil. A new dimension in the technology of terror.
Alan fired Richard Matheson, who was a great writer, and he says, why don't we bring Carl in? So I talked to Carl, of course. He was going to make money, and Carl did 1, and he did 2, and he did 3. So we had a good relationship, and so yeah, he came in and worked a couple weeks, and there was a couple things. The first script had Mickey Rooney in it, some character that had nothing to do with anything. And I thought, well, that was really silly. But that was before even Richard. There was somebody else that wrote the basic Jaws 3 thing. And then Richard came in and redid it. And then so Carl was the third writer. I think that Carl made it like he did on the other Jaws movies, simplified it, made it more linear.
Carl Gottlieb was a member of the famous comedy group The Committee. He forged a relationship with a young Steven Spielberg, working together on a project that eventually went nowhere. But their bond had formed. When prepping Jaws, Spielberg sent the script over to Gottlieb to look at and asked Gottlieb what part he wanted to play. In Gottlieb's own words from his book, The Jaws Log, when I first came on board as an actor, we had discussed my writing ideas, but nothing had come of it. Now we were 11 days from start. And here we were, talking revisions. The Sunday Get Acquainted meeting turned into a 6-hour discussion of the script. On Monday, my agents confirmed a deal. On Tuesday, Stephen and I flew to Boston and Martha's Vineyard to start shooting a script that had not even been through its final rewrite and that was still largely uncast. After Jaws, the 70s were good to Gottlieb, and he was good to them when he wrote The Jerk with Steve Martin in 1979. However, it was because of his success on Jaws that Gottlieb was again brought in to polish up Jaws 2, and then he was brought back for a final time on Jaws 3.
Well, I did 1, and then under similar circumstances, they got in trouble when they started Jaws 2 without me. So they called me in at the last minute, and once again I went down and worked on set, trying to stay ahead of the schedule, and we did okay. It was one of the best grossing sequels of all time until Godfather 2. So, it was a very passable sequel. And the iron law of sequels is that only the last one loses money. The studio that was wary of the costs of sequels decided to outsource the production to a guy named Alan Landsberg. Once again, they started without me. They had a pretty serviceable script by Richard Matheson, of all people. And then they got in trouble again, so I had to fly down to Florida to the location and once again start writing to do what I could to make the script work a little better. By the time I come in on a picture like that, all the elaborate shark gags have to be pre-planned and choreographed and built, so I can't suddenly come in and say, oh, and in this version, the shark plays the piano. And they, oh, well, wait, we don't have a piano, we didn't hire a music coordinator. I'm kind of working within the limit. And in Jaws 3D, to contain the cost and not have to shoot on the open ocean, they had a very credible idea of shooting it in a SeaWorld kind of a theme park. And they did. They shot it at SeaWorld in Orlando. And then the art department came up with the imaginary underwater ocean environment that was used as if it was an existing park. Yeah, they were having problems with the characters being believable. Everybody, the fish is such a dramatic prop that in order for the story to work, you have to care about the victims, you have to care about the people who are going to try to stop the shark, and that was part of the problem. They had a kind of an unsympathetic shark killer played by a British actor with a Cockney sidekick. I don't know why they made those choices, but they did. And Dennis was playing one of the Brody kids grown up. I think John Putch played the younger brother. So I had to give them some sort of manageable human relationship and make the romance a little bit more believable and do all the things that give the finished film some semblance of credibility. Any story has to be human at its base, and that goes for comedy or horror. In comedy, you have sympathetic people who get into predicaments that are funny. In horror, you have sympathetic people who get into predicaments that have bloody consequences. But in all cases, you got to care about the people first before shit happens to them. You got to love Buster Keaton before he ever gets hit with a pie, and you have to love Jamie Lee Curtis before the demon comes after her. So my job as a writer is create characters that are appealingly human and that you empathize with, so that when they get into trouble, you care. You don't shout, "Look out behind you," if you don't give a shit about the character on screen. And my job is to make the audience say, "Look out behind you." It was hard to do, and I was stuck with some awkward early 80s slang that kind of dates the movie a little bit. Oh, no, when I see the movie, I go, oh, boy, I'd like to rewrite that line. But at the time, under the pressure of creating something quick and good, either take some shortcuts or you do it as best that you can at the time. We're not responsible for history. Whatever happens afterwards happens, and very few people can predict. I mean, that's the beauty of the first Jaws, is that except for some wide lapels and silly haircuts and the absence of cell phones, the picture is timeless. That Martha's Vineyard, that island, still exists pretty much the way it was photographed 43 years ago. And there's no honor in doing the third or the fourth version of something unless you can really get a new angle on it, and that doesn't happen very often. The sequel business is, I think Sid Sheinberg said it best. He said, you give people a nice fish dinner. When you invite them back to your house, they're not expecting roast beef. They want another fish dinner. And everybody had their own agenda. The studio was trying to preserve the franchise. Joe wanted to direct more than anything. So, everybody made compromises. And I don't know if I would have made those compromises if I had been given the opportunity to do it from scratch. But they didn't ask, so fuck them.
And I had another problem with Landsberg in that this was not House of Wax with two big Mitchells. They had made a single lens 3D, but they were really bad. And my cameraman who was doing tests, he called it the Ultra Jam because it just kept jamming. And we got Aeroflex to make us some good new 3D cameras, but they weren't finished yet. And Alan said, no, we're going to start shooting anyway. So we shot for a week, and then we got our new cameras, and we had to reshoot everything because it didn't work. Whatever, the convergence didn't match with the old cameras and the new. With the new camera, it worked fine, and we had an underwater camera. But there's a number of problems. First of all, you take a 35 millimeter film and you cut it horizontally so that, let's say, the top half is the left eye and the bottom half is the right eye. So now I'm working with an aperture that is pretty wide, and that's always difficult to compose shots where you got so much negative space around. So that's a constant problem for a director and for a cameraman to deal with. But then it's the convergence, and we would have dailies, and we would see if we got that correct on the camera, but also the projectors had to be focused, so the convergence. And that's a lot of problems we had when it was released, is that the projectionists didn't get it right. People would be rubbing their eyes because not of the film, but of the projectors. So it was a headache. And then I had various experts, nice guys, but they started off telling me, oh, you can't pan, and you can't do this too close, and you can't do that. How am I going to make this movie if I can't pan and I can't do that? And after a while, Jim Kotner, who was my director of photography, and he says, come on, Joe, we're just going to do it. Do what you want, and we'll see how it works out. And so it was just a constant battle between the technology. And also I had a producer who would, first day of shooting, would come and want to give me the shots. First of all, I'm a production designer, and I'm used to doing storyboards and playing out shots. So I knew the continuity, how I wanted to get the shots. I don't need somebody to come and tell me where to put the camera. And I made that really clear with him. And that became a difficulty. But I had a large first assistant, and I said, just keep him away from me. So it was, as you could tell, it was a bit of a battle from day one with Alan. And also, when I started talking to him, I said, we'll get into this about sharks. I said, we got to make some sharks. He said, what for? I said, it's a Jaws movie. Oh, no, I've got a lot of stock footage of sharks. We're just going to use stock footage of sharks, and then we'll use, dummy people and stuff. That's what I was working with. Anyway, we wore him down, and we did end up building, I just talked to Roy Arbogast, but we did a bigger shark. We did a head, we did a full shark, and we did 2 different towing rigs. We figured out most of the shark problems by number 1, but I want to explain very quickly that Bob Matty was supposed to have a year to make the shark. And everybody I talked to, affects people, including Disney and whatever, said it would take a year because it's never really been done, a full-size shark in the ocean. So when the book came out and they cut the thing from a year to 4 months, all that development time, all that practice of the thing was cut out. So basically, if the shark worked, we shot it. If it didn't, it was a test. But towards the end, if you look at the storyboards, we got every shot with the shark. It was working fine. On Jaws 2, the new director got with Bob. I was off doing Close Encounters, and he gave Bob, I wanted to flip over and do all this. So it got much more complicated. When I came aboard, I simplified it again, but it worked pretty consistently. Now, the only problem with Jaws 2 is the studio now wanted so many shark shots that we just were shooting shark all the time. And then we ended up cutting an awful lot of them out. On 3, we had a situation where we have a guy in the shark, so we needed a bigger shark. So I put Roy Arbogast in charge. So we built a bigger head, a more like 30-foot shark. In my preliminary sketches on Jaws, based on the galley sheets, which are in my book, I had a number of different sharks and angles and stuff, and I had a shot of from inside the shark's mouth. And Stephen looked at it and he just laughed. He said, "Would you ever need to be inside the shark? This is silly." Anyway, he loved all the other ones, but so funny. 2 movies later, I got a shot from inside the mouth. But we did something different, too, that we had never done before, but I heard that this was possible. In the tunnel sequence, there was a tunnel at SeaWorld. We shot stuff that. Then we built our own tunnel that got flooded, and they had to cut the doors, and the shark was biting it. All that was dry. We did the shark dry. There was no water when it was attacking, and it was pretty convincing. Mechanically, the sharks were fine. Well, the problem was Rupert Hitzik was a producer that Alan brought in from New York. And Rupert was a nice guy, very aggressive. He wanted to do a lot of second unit stuff. And we sort of made a pact that we would work together. And so I let him sort of get in between Alan and me. Rupert, you're the producer. Go talk to Alan. I need this. I need a shark. I need that. So Rupert sort of buffered that a little bit when he came on. Well, I was really disappointed, and Alan was controlling everything. And one thing, though, I got to tell you, which was really disturbing, I did not have the final cut. And it takes a while before you can get the final cut. The studios control it. So I cut the movie like 2 hours and 3 minutes, the same as the other 2 Jaws. And they cut out about 25 minutes of it. It was very disturbing because one of the LA critics, he criticized my direction that I expedited things too quickly. I didn't give enough story background and personal background. That's not fair because I did, if you ever saw my cut. But that's the way life goes, You don't have control. People criticize stuff that you had nothing to do with. Basically, Alan had control. He sort of owned the picture. Universal was going to distribute it. I don't really know how much they actually had, and why would they be sympathetic to me?
Jaws 3 received a critical lashing upon its release. The scene that Jaws 3D is remembered for is its climax, when the shark breaks through the glass of the underwater observatory. It's the film's Chekhov's gun. As soon as you see the underwater structure, you know the shark is going right through it. and Alves set up a great practical effect for the water rushing into the observatory. A set was suspended above a giant water tank and dropped in with stuntmen inside to simulate the turbulent thrashing of the breach. In the scene, the water fills the set and envelops the camera all in one shot. The cause of this effect is much less impressive. The 3D shark moves in slow motion, but the shark is absolutely motionless in its flight pattern. After some time, it eventually reaches the glass, and it doesn't so much crash into it, but gently bump it, surprisingly resulting in the glass shattering into the third dimension. The scene was a crystallization of all the difficulties of Jaws 3 facing Alves, a man who had helped make the shark look so convincing in the original.
I hated it, and I'll tell you why. Because it came very slow, and it never really broke frame. It never really got into the audience, and I was so... The effects guys were good, and they said, here's the problem. If you imagine a film aperture, okay? Now, you could take a snake. I could get a snake way out into the audience. But the trouble with a shark is that as soon as it hits the dorsal fin, it hits the frame, and it bounces back. You have to watch that frame. The dorsal fin, the shark could get as much as the head, but as soon as the frame, the dorsal, anything hits the frame, it bounces back. It doesn't. You could stick your arm up, as soon as you get to your shoulders, it hit the frame. And I was never really quite satisfied with that. And there again, it got into post-production, and I kept losing more and more power because Landsberg started taking over. Okay, it's in post. You shot it. You got yours. Now we're doing it. And I complained as much. We had one effects group, and I went and I looked at their sharks. I said, this doesn't look like our shark. Oh, yeah, well, we're going to try to improve it. I said, no, it's got to match the shark. Your stuff's got to match our stuff. Oh, well, yeah, but I thought this looked better. No, it doesn't. What better? They didn't understand. It was crazy. So we got rid of those guys. I got them to fire them. We got the Praxis, who was, they were very good, but we just had the 3D problem. It got very, very difficult towards the end. And, so, yeah, I was not happy with that.
Alan Landsberg, I had a lot of contact with him, and it wasn't that great. He was obsessed with keeping the budget low because that was where he was going to make his money. And he was a guy who thought he could do it all himself, which was another problem. And finally, he was such a stingy jerk when it came to the finale where the shark burst into the control room in 3D. That shot took a great deal of effort and time to set up, and he would not allow take two. So take one is in the movie. Whatever credibility the film has is lost at that moment because the shark is moving like a Goodyear blimp. It's not at all threatening. You're waiting forever for it to get to the glass control room. It's a very unfortunate finale.
But it also grossed $45 million domestically and $42 overseas. Unfortunately, it was significantly down from the $187 million that Jaws 2 made worldwide. But there may have been another reason for its financial decline. According to Ray Zone's 3D Revolution, the history of modern stereoscopic cinema, Jaws 3D was drawing huge audiences. When the most shocking thing occurred, it was pulled from most theaters to be replaced by considerably lesser box office draws. Originally planned to be run for a full month, then replaced by Universal's next 3D release, Metal Storm, Jaws 3D only ran for 2 weeks in many theaters. A Universal executive said he had been simply told by his superiors to stop runs of Jaws 3D. A 3D trailer for Metal Storm was attached by Universal to the release prints of Jaws 3D. The plan was to push Metal Storm into the 3D theaters if Jaws 3D played short. However, Universal may have been premature with that action. Jaws 4 would be made, but Carl Gottlieb and Joe Alves, who had been there from the very beginning, would no longer be involved. Both men would continue to work in Hollywood for the rest of their long and prosperous careers. However, it would be Joe Alves' first and last directorial stint.
I know there's a lot of criticism of it, but there's a lot of criticism of the first two Jaws too. Even Jaws was The critics weren't too crazy about it. If you go back and look at the early reviews, Jaws 2 got criticized heavily, and I got killed. But you know, you do what you can to make it the best. And what I got into was developing my own projects, and I had a number of them. I had one called Adventure One. I was based up in Utah, Salt Lake. Worked on it for 7 months. I had the thing designed. We were building creatures and things, and then after like 7 months, they just folded. The money was coming from Japan. That didn't happen. And then after that, I got married and had kids, and I thought, well, maybe I better go back to work, you know. That's the way the business goes. I did a lot of second unit, though, Starman for John Carpenter. So anyway, yeah, I would bounce back and forth designing and second unit. And then after that, Bill Gilmore and I had a number of projects to do, but that didn't happen, and on and on. So that's how it goes.
For more information on Jaws, check out Carl Gottlieb's classic behind-the-scenes book, The Jaws Log. And take a look into Joe Alves' new book, Designing Jaws.
People might want to buy it. They can still get it at the Catalina Museum, just catalinamuseum.org. And as you can see, it depicts all the storyboards and the planning of the movie, not so much the making of the movie, but I know a lot of people are interested in it, and not quite sure how to get it.
Soundings in the channel of old England, from Ushant to Scilly is 34 leagues.